Welcome back to Law and Crime, everybody. I'm Jesse Weber, and thanks for joining us. We are right now live in the Scott Nelson trial out of Florida, and this is the death penalty phase. This is what the jury has to determine. What will be the fate of this man that they convicted last week of brutally murdering, kidnapping and brutally murdering Jennifer Fulford? They have to determine, will his punishment be life in prison or the death penalty? Now, on the stand right now is an interesting witness. This is an expert when it comes to the federal prison system. And we're learning more about what the prison life is like, and more specifically, what the life of Mr. Nelson was like in this prison. And what we've learned so far is that he had some conflicts with certain groups. He was put into special housing, segregated from other communities. He had been cooperating with law enforcement, which is a big no-no in prison. And it's important to understand this to get a full picture of who this man is and maybe what led him to make the decision to ultimately kill Jennifer Fulford, because this jury has to determine if they are going to recommend ending the life of another human being. So let's go back live and we'll learn more. Okay, so let's break down what's been happening so far. Joining me back again is, of course, forensic death investigator from Jacksonville State University, Joseph Scott Morgan. I'm also joined by former senior judge and attorney, Judge Gail Tusan. Great to have you both here. Now, Judge, I'd like to start with you, new to the program here. So I'd like to start with you about your views about the prison system here. We're learning a lot about it. And is he a product of this system? How should we be thinking about this?
I think any defendant, repeat offender, is going to absorb and be influenced by what they're experiencing while they're incarcerated. So certainly his past has contributed to where he is today, but I don't believe that that's what is the cause of what he's done. So it's something to be taken into consideration, of course, during the penalty phase. But is not, in my opinion, an excuse.
Well, look, the defense is trying to do whatever they can. They don't have a lot of room to work with, especially when the defendant took the stand in the trial phase. We're waiting to jump back live. I just want to see if they might still be going over evidence right now. We're waiting for this expert on the federal prison system. Yeah, okay, so let's go back. We'll learn more about what's happening here. Okay, so we see where this is going, Joseph, now don't we? That he might not be the best guy that the defense wants to portray him as, or not even that, just trying to say that he is responsible for some wrongdoing in that prison. Am I understanding this correctly?
Yeah, that's what's, the thing about prison life, Jesse, when it comes to all the paperwork that's generated, you live, these people live under a microscope. So everything that they do, every jot and tittle is documented day in and day out. And so if you're a screw up, if you make some kind of comment, if you engage in some kind of behavior that's not acceptable, it's going to have to be written up. And so he's got this litany that goes back years and years. I'm sure that there are reams and reams of files on this fellow that the feds have, and any other local jurisdiction has had custody over this gentleman over the course of his life. So you can go over it, just ad nauseum.
Oh, yeah, and we're getting a full picture of Mr. Scott Nelson. Now, Judge, let me ask you this. The jury will ultimately recommend their sentence, and then the judge will impose it. You tell me, is this a difficult case for the death penalty or not?
Well, each of those juries is going to have to decide that for themselves and then collectively come up with a decision. So if you're asking whether or not I believe the death penalty should be imposed in this case, I don't have an opinion. But there certainly is a good balance, it seems to me, of evidence in this phase, so that the jury is getting to know what he was like, more as a person, as well as the effect that his crime has had on the victim and the victim's family.
Yeah, speaking of the crime itself, Joseph, we heard from the medical examiner yet again, just a horrible, horrific death for Jennifer Fulford. I mean, what were you thinking about when you heard what the medical examiner had to say?
I think that probably the most horrific part of this to me was the fact that she had been driven around for a period of time prior to her the final fatal event that took place, and all the while she's entrapped She's within his control, and she's got duct tape all over her head. And you can imagine the panic that is setting in this poor woman. Again, I have to throw this word torture out there. This is a torturous event. Now, I don't know if it's going to necessarily qualify, or if it qualified in the legal definition of torture, but just from a human perspective, this is a torturous event that she endured prior to this. And the jury is fully aware of this, Jesse. And the jury, hey, listen, the ME went into some description about talking what it's like to hold your breath.
Right.
And then and he went into detail about that. And just think about that. And that's something that the jurors can identify with, not to mention being restrained all of this time.
Yeah, and she died from a combination of asphyxiation and those stab wounds. Just a horrible situation. Now, Judge, we haven't had a chance to talk about this case, and I'm sure you've had an opportunity to see the defendant take the stand and explain how he felt he was justified for what Joseph just said he did. What are your thoughts on when he took the stand?
You know, when a defendant decides to take the stand, it's just a big risk. He certainly didn't help his cause. I'm sure that his attorney didn't want him to take the stand, but nonetheless, the defendant has that right, ultimately right, to decide to testify or not. You know, he reminds me of several defendants that I have had in cases, very self-focused, pretty out of touch in terms of, you know, the demands that he makes for his own convenience and comfort. You know, looking back and winking at the family. I mean, he's a unique character, and the jury has a big decision to make.
Yes, they do. Yes, they do. But we're not done with what's happening right now in this courtroom. Okay, Judge, I want to start with you as we listen to this. Your thoughts on listening to a family member, again, hasn't seen his brother in 25 years, did discuss their upbringing. How important is this for the jury to hear?
It's really important for the jury to get an understanding of Mr. Nelson, defendant Nelson's upbringing. So any human information that can be gathered and presented to the jury, I think, is important. This jury is very attentive. They're paying attention. They want to try to understand how such a horrible crime could have been committed and what would have contributed to it, all factors. So hearing from the brother, I think, is important. His description of the mother's mental illness obviously is an effort by the defense to, you know, I guess, put out there that Mr. Nelson himself may genetically have some similar issues. However, the brother is not a physician or a mental health expert, so he's just testifying about what he remembers and what took place. So I don't think he adds a whole lot to the story, quite frankly,
Right.
But he does indicate the household that he and his brother grew up in.
Well, let's say we take his story as true and the facts as true. Joseph, are there common characteristics that you were hearing about Scott Nelson, his upbringing, that you would say, hey, listen, I've listened to the backgrounds of other killers, and there's some similarities here. What do you make of it?
Yeah, this cycle of abuse, I think that comes along. Also, the familial history of mental illness. That's, you know, kind of a generational curse sometimes. I think that travels downrange with the products of these marriages and these sorts of things. And so you have this, and it becomes a perfect storm. You attempt to integrate out of even the familial relationships into general society, and it's very difficult. These people begin to have problems out there because their norm is not everybody else's norm.
Right.
And then they cycle into the prison system because they've committed something that's an offense.
That is a good way of putting it. His norm is not everybody else's norm. Again, I can't help but think about the defendant on the stand, thinking that he was completely justified for what he did. But let's not talk about Scott Nelson. Let's go back to James Nelson, and we'll hear more of what the brother had to say from yesterday. Okay, so Judge, let me ask you this. There was an interesting moment in court yesterday when the prosecutor was objecting to this brother testifying, and the defendant got up and objected to the prosecutor objecting. My view of it was he didn't want his brother's story interrupted. Could be wrong, I don't know. But if that's the question I have for you is, what is the narrative that Scott Nelson wants this world to hear, that he wants this jury to hear, that he wants this court to hear? Because there's something that I believe in that testimony that he's trying to get out. And again, we're still waiting to see if he takes the stand today in the penalty phase. So what's your view on that?
I think he's trying to paint the picture of an individual who grew up in an environment where he didn't have much control over what was happening to his mothers, to whom I'm sure he was attached and wanted to be able to protect and wasn't able to protect. And as a result of that, he's been traumatized. There's no doubt. He's seen his father mistreat his mother. That has huge psychological ramifications. And I think he wants the jury to hear from his brother, who he maybe believes would be better able and might be more credible than he in telling their story growing up.
That may very well be true. You know, the other side of it is, Joseph, that he's trying to control this whole process and get out the narrative that he wants. I guess the question is, if he takes the stand, which we're all waiting to see what will happen in this courtroom, you think he's going to address his brother's comments?
I don't know. He very well might. Let's think about the reality of this guy's life prior to him, winding up in the victim's life. If he sees people in his own environment as a child that are abused and he's abused and all these sorts of things, you kick that forward to when he encountered this poor woman. And remember what he said. He referred to her, I believe, as collateral damage.
Yes, he did.
That she is just objectified, that she has no value to him whatsoever. We can't expect as a society that we're going to have any value to him if the things that were most precious and close to him as a child had no value. So the arithmetic is there. You do it. And if you cut this guy loose on the rest of society, it's going to unleash havoc, and he's done that. Yeah,
it's horrifying, the havoc that he's released. Judge, just to go back to the idea of him testifying and what he said, you had mentioned earlier that it didn't do him any good. Now, I'm going to challenge you on that, and I'll just say this is why. The fact that jury deliberated for a much longer time than many people thought that they would, he testified, admitted to killing Jennifer Fulford. Wouldn't have been surprised if they came back in 10 minutes. But they spent a few hours deliberating. And I have to imagine that one of the things that they were deliberating was this premeditation aspect of the murder charge. And the reason they'd be deliberating that is because of some of the statements he made that he never intended or planned to kill this woman. If he were to take the stand, again, now in the penalty phase, could he raise some questions for this jury in this really important determination for them?
Well, he absolutely may be more effective in this phase because the jury is going to have to balance the evidence going to the aggravating circumstances versus the evidence going to the mitigating evidence. And so everything that they're hearing, that's what's going through the jury's mind. They'll be given a full charge, of course, at the end. So I would think that his testimony as to what he did, what he was thinking, the effect it's had on him, whether there's any remorse, all of that will go to those factors.
Yep, not an easy determination, I'll tell you that much. Okay, let's take a break. When we come back, we're waiting to jump live. Who knows what we can expect in this case? We'll be right back.